Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America. Here in the middle of the country, Iowa Catholic Radio is our home stadium in the World Baseball Championship of Catholic broadcasts. And we want to say thank you to our sponsor, Mercy College of Health Sciences. I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director of the Center for Human Flourishing out there. Bud, what do you do for the old ball team?
I'm at Mercy College of Health Sciences as the Associate Provost. I consider myself a big baseball fan, but not as big of a baseball fan as Mr. Justin White, Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries for the Diocese of Des Moines.
He should come out of the dugout and tip his hat. He's very much a baseball guru that helps us with all those things. But to keep up with this metaphor, Bud, of baseball, because the World Baseball Classic was amazing. I know it's been a few days.
And we're moving into baseball weather. I'm getting the itch.
Yeah, but it was such a great start to baseball. I hope it enlivened the hearts of many people. But, you know, what would you, I guess the president of a school is like the manager, the Tony La Russa. Yeah. So, like, are you like the pitching coach? What do you imagine you are?
The Associate Provost?
Yeah.
I think I sweep up the trash after the game ends.
I don't even want to. The mission officer is probably like one of the people in the stands, like, get your peanuts. No, stuff.
Yeah, this is a bad metaphor because I'm very unmusical, but I like to imagine myself as the guy playing the organ.
Yeah, I do like.
I love that guy.
Yeah,
I love how organs found their way into
baseball,
a modern sport.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But you know what else is fantastic? Mercy College, who underwrites our show. Thank you for underwriting our show, Mercy College, mchs.edu. Go there and look at what season's about to start, Bud, and what pitcher, catcher, batter you could be a part of. I'm running out of metaphors, but mchs.edu.
Well, speaking of seasons, we're coming up to the inauguration of our president. So right after Holy Week, the week following, Dr. Adrian Henry, fourth president of Mercy College of Health Sciences, will be inaugurated. It's going to be a great series of events, April 14th. But I think it's okay to say on air that if folks...
17th, right?
That's
it. Wait.
Yep.
Yep, we're getting the calendar out.
And the Monday is the 10th.
14th.
14th, right. Yep.
You win.
That morning, I believe, 9 a.m., correct me if I'm wrong, there will be a mass in honor, kind of like coordinated with the inauguration. And so, even if you can't make it to Mass that morning, we do cover your prayers, both for the radio station, but also for the important work that's being done at Mercy College of Health Sciences, training the next generation of healthcare leaders in the legacy of the spirit and spirit of the Sisters of Mercy.
It's going to be a home run, folks. So, Bud, the World Baseball Classic. Yeah. I mean, we really got to go. I mean, we're Cardinals fans, but it made me want to go watch an iCubs game. That's how much the WBC was awesome to watch.
Well, you know what it reminded me? I get really frustrated because, this year I tuned into, for instance, the NBA All-Star Game, and it's almost unwatchable. Just not competitive, not interesting. But, Bo, I don't think this is a purely nostalgia thing. When we were, 9 years old, the NBA All-Star Game was great. Yes. Certainly, Major League Baseball All-Star Game was great. It's still very good. But the World Baseball competition...
Classic.
Classic, yeah. I knew it was WBC.
Yeah, I think so.
What it reminded me is, you can have a competitive venue outside of, the Major League, the leagues, professional
Season,
leagues.
Yeah.
And have it just be amazing. Those guys were giving their heart and soul.
I can't wait for this to totally destroy World Cup soccer. We'll never think about World. You heard me speaking of other people out at the diocese. John Wynn. Days are numbered, right? Baseball, I don't know if that's going to be true, but it was really awesome to see the world care about baseball. And America didn't quite pull it out, but it's not fair because Japan had the guy who could literally basically play every position.
Ohtani?
Yeah, I mean, gee whiz. The guy comes into the ninth throwing 100-mile-an-hour heaters at his own teammate. That was pretty cool.
That was amazing, and we've got an amazing show squared away from you. The great thing about this time of year, we're walking through Lent, but some amazing feast days. So just journeying through St. Patrick's Day, honoring St. Joseph in March as well. And then March 25th, the day that our show airs actually is in honor of Our Lady's Annunciation. So we're going to be talking about St. Joseph and Our Lady, silence, the will, all sorts of things on today's show.
They basically are our all-stars. That's like, so we're going to bring the heat and hit a grand slam. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. We're back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, this week, kind of bedressed, that's the wrong word, bookended, how's that, with two very important feasts, especially as I think Catholicism has developed in the modern world, but especially in America, bookended with what is now probably number 2 and number 3 important figure behind Jesus. We, of course, have the Feast of St. Joseph, which is the 19th, was the 19th, right? Yeah. And then the Feast of the Annunciation, which is always March 25th. So pretty interesting, right, that like they sort of butt up next to each other, and you have a week in between. And I think, are they always in Lent, or are they mostly in Lent?
I want to say always in Lent. Oh, man, you put me on the spot.
I think
right when you get to St. Patrick, St. Joseph, you're there.
Yeah, no, that one has to be. And then I actually think the Annunciation, there's like very, very weird circumstances in which it can be like the week of. But otherwise, yes, absolutely. It's so the point that we're getting at is they're very Lentinian. It's often the case that these are two of the feasts in Lent that we get to relax from our fasting in order to feast for two important people. I only say the whole bit about the modern church because St. Joseph, in some ways, has become, I would say, more prevalent devotionally than St. John the Baptist, which probably in the ancient church and even in the medieval church was probably firmly number 3, Jesus, Mary, and then St. John the Baptist, Joseph. But I think it's an interesting bookend. We can talk about both, the lives of St. Joseph and sort of devotionally how people center those things. But me liking to make weird points about these things. People often talk about St. Joseph's silence, and then they often talk about Mary's fiat, behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it done to thee according to thy will. Silence and the will. We've been lucky enough to be teaching the Catechetical Institute here in Des Moines, and so we've been talking about prayer quite a bit. And I don't know about you, maybe you can tell me, in fact, how these two might, Mary and Joseph, guide your talk about prayer to the people who are taking our classes. But I keep coming up on the importance of both silence and the human will in prayer and how both don't seem to get enough airplay. So, but in that whole matrix of things, right, I think that's what we're going to talk about today. Joseph and Mary being these supreme bookends during March, but also maybe how silence and the will and just prayer is reflected in their lives.
Well, I think what strikes me about St. Joseph, Bo, and I don't know if this is exactly what you're driving out, but when I think of the constellation of the saints, there are some saints that intimidate me. I'll just be honest. So I look at someone like St. Padre Pio and the suffering that he went through, the misunderstanding that he experienced, of course, the stigmata. And I think to myself, I will never get there. I don't necessarily look forward to stigmata, but, there's also these, there's some accounts of St. Padre Pio, like bilocating the people and, kind of like God using him in miraculous ways. And a lot of that seems very far from my day-to-day life.
You're just not very mobile or wound driven.
No, yeah, that's right. I
cut my hand and had to get a tetanus shot. So maybe no, I'm kidding. Keep going.
Did I mention on the show a couple weeks ago about my rib contusion playing pickup basketball?
Oh no, but that's not really stigma. It's sort of like the spear in the side, maybe.
It's close, but no, playing pickup basketball, I feel like there are unwritten rules about how, like, what percentage you should play at. And this guy was playing at 120%. He may be a listener of the show, so I should be careful, but like just totally, I didn't want to take a charge and pick up basketball game, but I was forced to in the moment, and my rib has not been the same the last few weeks. But was
that like in the spirit of March Madness, right?
That's right. I need to retire. But like when I have just a minor injury like that, like the family knows about it. It's like on the surface, and I'm just walking around their house moaning and groaning. So not ready for stigmata yet. But with St. Joseph, what astounds me, and it's kind of analogous to the flowering of devotion around St. Theresa of Lisieux, is that, like you said, he's become, he's maybe surpassed John the Baptist in the kind of devotion that Catholics have to him. In most Catholic churches, on one side of the altar will be a statue or image of Our Lady, and then on the other side, St. Joseph, the foster father of Jesus. And I'm struck by that because Joseph didn't write any books. He says very little in the New Testament. After the early important incidents like fleeing to Egypt, he sort of recedes from the scene. So I'm just kind of struck at the impact he had, you could say really like on human history through this kind of quiet dedication to serving Our Lady, to taking care of Jesus, to humbly going about his vocation in life and his status in life. And to me, that's very inspiring as a husband and a father, and someone who, like, my day, most days of the week is characterized by not the kind of labor that St. Joseph had, but like work and work responsibilities.
Yeah. I mean, you don't fly to Egypt, but you do actually have to go visit different places for Mercy College that, have instructional places.
Far-flung places like Davenport.
That's right, which is it's kind of Egypt. No. What I will say that it immediately strikes me is I think we can jump from exactly this sort of littleness of St. Joseph, right, that we don't hear from him very often. We hear about him dreaming and having images revealed to him. He's, of course, known as the patron saint of a holy death because Jesus and Mary accompanied him on his deathbed. But you're right. Like, it's interesting that this saint that we don't have a lot of words from slowly, it's like he's a slow burning saint. And it's now in the modern world that we're fascinated by St. Joseph. On one hand, I think it's because we have such a noisy world. Yeah. So it's interesting that a very quiet saint, a father figure saint, has taken such precedent. But I actually think we're not really learning the lesson that maybe he has to teach us in terms of this silence. So, Bud, one of the things I know in teaching about prayer, there's a lot of, if I go down this trapdoor, we can go very, very far down this trapdoor. But you and I, we've talked about it on the show before about how the mediums through which we know things, the extensions of ourselves, really forms the way that we look at not only communication, but just the way we understand ourselves and how we think. And so it makes a lot of sense, right, that people living in the digital world, very much formed by the digital media, might think that life is coming at them too fast, but that they want to do a lot of research to figure out their prayer lives. But then it still falls back on two sort of things. So you have people very much formed by television and electric media going what sort of performance, what is the thing I have to perform in order to pray well? But then even the sort of backbone of all Western modern civilization, very text-driven. So people are what are the right things to read? How should I go find things to pray? What's the right prayer books to get? In all of these things, I think sometimes we very much privilege prayer to where it starts to sound very intellectual or extremely emotive. Yeah. So you have this sort of binary where people go, what you really need to do in prayer is find the right ones, do the research, really understand prayer. And then on the other hand, people are like, no way, Jose, this is totally nerding out. You dorks are ruining prayer. What we really need is, it needs to be about the heart and emotion. What's interesting is it seems like prayer, if you read deeply into it, is neither of those things. So you read saint after saint that talk about it's the simple and the little ones that really understand how to pray. And it's not necessarily that they think through things. Mental prayer is a type of prayer, but in many ways is at the service of contemplation, which is not merely egg-headed knowledge about God. But conversely, it is definitively the case that the great praying saints have all said any sort of consolation you would get emotionally is fleeting. It's fine, but in many ways, to go seeking after that is to misunderstand prayer itself. But it starts to be interesting is, what is prayer? And on one hand, right, we go further back sort of in human history when it comes to the mediums through which we communicate. And an obvious one is prayer is very oral. It has to do with it's making vocal what we want, from God. So that's obvious why in public prayer or even, mumbling prayer, right, that we're supposed to speak. There's a way we're supposed to try to listen. But this is where it gets back to St. Joseph. I think even more basic is silence because, of course, God created the entire world through silence. And it's through the medium of silence in which God speaks in his language of love. This is from the book, actually, Bud, that you assigned me for Lent, so good job. It's called Contemplative Enigmas. Do you remember the author?
Father Robert Haggerty, maybe?
Yeah, Father Haggerty. And he makes this great point that often when we're in prayer and we want God to speak to us, we're expecting to like literally hear something said or words to appear in our vision. And he goes, actually, God, who is love, will obviously speak through love, which is to give us a desire. And so the language of God that God speaks in silence is desire, but he actually raises those desires in our hearts. And if you think about St. Joseph, right, where does he get nearly all of his information that he's supposed to get? Unlike Mary, who the angel appears to specifically and speaks to, which we can talk about later in the show, St. Joseph gets most of his directions in his dreams.
Yeah.
And on one hand, they're figurative, but a lot of it is about a desire of what he's supposed to do. And so I think the silence St. Joseph gives and why it's so important for us to contemplate this original of all mediums. Because remember, folks, before any sound existed, before any language was created by humans, God spoke the entire world into existence in the medium of silence, out of his love. And when he speaks to us in prayer, he often speaks to us silently through the silent language of desire. To understand that about prayer, but I think, is to open up entire vistas and maybe expel a lot of misunderstandings about what prayer is all about.
Well, I'm bad at prayer, so I feel a little sheepish giving counsel on the radio, but I'm giving this counsel to myself, and it's mostly spiritual writers who I'm channeling that I've found helpful. But I think, Bo, you mentioned prayer as an act of the will primarily, and I feel like sometimes when Christians first try to move into a deeper prayer life, they're really disturbed by the distractions that they experience when they pray. So like they'll go to a chapel, they'll go to adoration and try to be in the presence of God and remain silent and at peace in that presence. And inevitably, our minds get flooded by hundreds, thousands of different cares and anxieties. And Faith Journey, this group that we meet together on Monday nights and talking with those attendees, one thing that we got into this last week was like fighting off the distractions is actually part of prayer. So like you could experience those distractions and move to a place where you feel like guilty about it. You're like, oh man, like I want to pray, and I enter into the space and all of a sudden like I'm thinking about 100 different things. But because prayer is an act of the will, we could say that the moment that you experience those distractions is the moment of truth. And God is asking you, like, will you continue to walk further ahead even though right now it's challenging and difficult? So I was talking to the group that for myself, I need a good like half hour, 45 minutes to pray well, because the first 10 to 15 minutes is like stilling my heart. We used to have that assignment that we'd give to students in our servant leadership course where we asked them to remain silent for a period of time. And some of the students wrote just amazing papers about what that was like. But again, I think if they struggled with the silence, they felt like they had somehow like failed the assignment or not done it properly. But that experience of the challenge is part and parcel of like the place that I think God is moving us to.
Yeah, Herbert McCabe, I think, is really good on this. I think there's two general things to say. One, I think people will go like, oh, that's very helpful. Thank you, Herbert McCabe. And then the other one's my idea, and people will disagree with me a lot. So here we go. Herbert McCabe makes this point that one of the big hangups we have in prayer is we think God's like judging the quality of our prayer. This is where you go like, oh, I must have struggled. And so when we go, oh man, I sit down to pray and I keep thinking about the laundry or someone I'm mad at or whatever, that we're like, well, those aren't high-minded enough thoughts to have in front of God. And so, of course, all of our thoughts are not quote unquote worthy of God because God doesn't need us, right? And so Herbert McCabe makes this point that, like, look, one of the things you can do with distractions is admit, so this goes back to will and desire, you desire something about those distractions. You either want it to be gone, you want the thing, you want the pony that you keep imagining, whatever it might be. But Herbert McCabe goes, look, instead of getting really ruffled about how I'm not having highfalutin enough thoughts about God, real productive prayer is to stop and ask, God, why do I keep having these distractions? Like, what is it about them? And actually taking those distractions and offering them up to the Lord. Now, to me, that's definitely a good one, especially for beginners. is to say it's not, and like notice that it's not psychology time. It's not, I need to like, use God as my psychiatrist, and I'm not bashing psychiatry. There's definitely room for it. So I'm trying to make a distinction here. But it is definitely the case to say, Lord, maybe there's something about this distraction that my own soul is presenting to myself because it's important to bring it to you. But the second thing, Bud, and this I think I'm taking from Theresa of Avila, I think some people might disagree. She makes a point that distractions in the end can't be stopped on this side of life. And she is a spiritual master. Yeah. And so her idea is to say, your thoughts are quite different from your will. And so for some people, they can just steal, I'm going to say it like in Oklahoma, steal their mind, make their mind calm. Mm-hmm. And other people really can't, right? Like, I think she thinks it's a lot more like the passions, right? Like, so some of us just feel fear more intensely than other people. And it's actually not very helpful to spend a lot of time trying to, feel fearless. It's how we react to the fear. So her idea is, if your will keeps stopping to try to push out the distraction, that's time your will is dealing with you and not God. Mm. And so she goes, the sort of next step in prayer is to just let your mind run off like a wild horse in the pasture. Yeah. And just keep focusing on widening your will to what God wants in that moment. And so I think that those are two very practical things. One, I think you can start doing tomorrow, folks, is if you try to have silent prayer and you keep having a distraction, Joseph was distracted by dreams. Stop and consider maybe where are those distractions coming from. The next step, which I think is very important but might take a while, is to eventually get to where you're just not concerned that your mind won't stay on task, and what you're working on is keeping your will attuned to God. Much harder to do, and it might sound like we're like, how can you do two things at once? But we do this all the time, where like I'm thinking, but I'm doing. Yeah. My will is having me do something else at the same time. And I actually think Joseph's serenity is something to imitate in this, and even ask his intercession for in prayer.
Well, I think Theresa of Avila said this, but I know St. Francis de Sales did, and it relates to what you're just sharing, Bo, that vocal prayer, so using words that were like pre-written, that the church has given to us and its great wisdom and care for us, that's really important, but that above all else, we should value mental prayer. And mental prayer is that kind of prayer where you sit in the presence of God, where you don't move automatically to like vocalizing your requests or using rote prayers, but you allow this space of silence. And that's so essential. As we've been talking, I was looking, by the way, the author that you mentioned earlier that I assigned you, that's pretty sad, was Father Donald Haggerty. I just want to give him the proper shout out since we mentioned his book. But another great book in our own time, Cardinal Robert Sarah wrote a book, The Power of Silence Against the Dictatorship of Relativism. And I love that subtitle. Like, we really do live in a society and a culture where there is a kind of dictatorship of relativism. And I don't give a lot of like formulas or six-step processes when it comes to the spiritual life. But I truly do believe that if we don't carve out space for silence, that we just simply cannot hear God's voice. You see that as a thread running through Scripture. I mean, my mind goes to the story of Elijah, where God comes to him not in a storm, not in a fire, not in an earthquake, but as a gentle whisper. And then preeminently in the life of someone like St. Joseph, who, by the shape of his life, was open to the voice of God. And when we make ourselves available in that way, sometimes God will even use something like a dream to communicate something important. And so I think slowly becoming aware, most foundationally, of God's presence, but even like you said, Bo, allowing the circumstances and details of our lives to say like maybe my anxiety for my child's illness, like there's something important there. And we take that wish to God and we say like, what are you asking of me? It might not be an answer that we first assume it's going to be, but obviously it's there providentially for a reason.
And I think it's interesting too. So just to finish up on silence, and then we can move to the will and Mary, I think, of the second segment. It's important to point out that we're not talking about silence in terms of like sound on earth, which is impossible. So there's actually this room up in Minnesota, Bud, that is, they have engineered to be the quietest room on earth.
Oh, that's terrifying to me. I read that story.
Yes.
And you're not supposed to be able to spend more than like a half hour without going crazy or something.
So the reason being is because if you eliminate sound, you will eventually hear stuff that you currently don't hear. For instance, you stay in that room, I think they say within 5 minutes, you can hear your blood flowing, which is nuts. So it's really important to point out that, like, when we say silence, we don't actually mean noise. It's helpful to get things as quiet as possible, sound-wise, but silence in this time in prayer is not meaning zero sound, which is impossible for embodied creatures on earth. But it's also not just silence of thoughts. That's what I'm getting at with Theresa of Avila is it might not be that you can silence your thoughts, especially if you're nervous or, anxious or whatever. It's silence of the will, which means I'm going to go sit in church and will nothing myself except what God wills. To do the will of another, right? That's the silence we're after. So I think most of us get obsessed with the silence of sound, which is good. But, that mindfulness people who are secular, that's what they're after, just calmness. Silence of thoughts is good if we can pull it off, but it's actually not necessary. We're going for silence of the will. Lord, give me the desires you want me to have because I desire you. And St. Joseph, I think, is a patron saint of that, and we should ask for his intercession. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Make sure to check out all the ways you can listen to the show. Of course, listen live through all of our affiliates here in central Iowa. You listen on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and anywhere you can get our podcast. So, Bud, today we're talking about the bookends here in March that we have with St. Joseph March 19th and then the Annunciation on March 25th. So we have Joseph and Mary, to consider as the, important saint number 2 and number 3, I guess if you're calling Jesus saint, right? So figure number 2 and 3 in the church, like you said, usually up there at the front by the altars in most American churches. We were talking about how hopefully we can look at their lives to give us insight into the spiritual life, especially the life of prayer, especially since we've been teaching about prayer in the Catechetical Institute here in the Diocese of Des Moines, talking about Joseph as a sort of patron of spiritual silence of the will that helps us in prayer. So maybe we should move to Mary and talk about, we brought up the will, but I think the will often can confuse people, but what exactly is the will? So if you don't mind starting off, I'm going to throw this to you. Why is it particularly that the Annunciation would be a good historical event to dwell on the reality of the will?
Yeah, I mean, if you can think or try to reflect on just how startling of a message that would be that you would, bear the Savior of the world. I know for myself, and depending on, like your own makeup as a person, like we can all face different sort of like struggles or temptations. But if you're someone who's sort of a bookish and maybe grew deeper into the faith through like an engagement with theology, I'm the sort of person who can sometimes boil down faith or the practice of the faith to some sort of like intellectual conclusion that I've drawn, or even like an intellectual assent, however important that is. So the church does say there are these revealed truths that are necessary for salvation. And as Catholics, we assent to those things being true. That being said, the will is at the center of the Christian life. And really a lot of times, as we're called by God, and Mary heard God's call in a particular way, so what's interesting, what you see in the history of salvation is that when God reveals himself, God reveals things, so he shows the people that he calls like a larger vision of himself, but at the same time, there's an obscurity. So I think I mentioned this on a recent episode, but for instance, when God calls Abraham, he says, go to the country that I will show you. So he doesn't map out the GPS like final destination from the very beginning. He calls Abraham to make this act of faith. I'm sure we can all give like similar testimonies in our own life. And so with Mary, there's like she perfectly embodies all the different things that I've just been mentioning. So God gives her this word, and Mary does, it says like ponder those things in her heart. Interestingly enough, St. John Henry Newman says like she's the first example of the development of doctrine, because development of doctrine properly understood is not a changing of the ideas or truths that are in place, but it's the church growing in its own subjective understanding of what God has revealed. So Mary doesn't take that revelation and just be like, okay, cool. she stops and reflects upon it, ponders her in her heart, and grows into this deeper understanding. But beyond that, and I think most significantly, Mary makes this act of the will, this fiat, let it be done unto me according to thy word. And that is something like we all have to imitate Mary's fiat that has, so I don't want to divorce the intellectual component of the faith from the act of the will, but in our lives, we can't get there simply by signing off on the truths alone. God asks us to step forward. So faith in its historic classical sense is not a movement of the intellect, but it's actually entrusting all of one's life to God.
Yeah, for Clear Creek Abbey, where I am an oblate, their motto is Ecce Fiat, which is the sort of first words in Latin of the two phrases she says. So Ecce is behold, Fiat, you know Latin better than me, but the sort of I will that it be done, sort of.
Let it be done.
Yeah, all of the Latin people are like, oh, no. Fire bow immediately. Yeah. But behold, the handmaid of the Lord, be it done to me according to thy word. So this is interesting, right? Because those are two spiritual functions. Behold is an intellectual thing. Yeah. It involves our senses, but the idea to one thing is like, if you go like, look, and that's sort of like, what's over there? But behold, right? Other than like seeming cooler than maybe you are, the idea to behold, right, is look and consider, like you said, ponder. But fiat is an act of the will. I will do these things. So it's important in the prayer life to realize, yes, there is a lot of beholding, and some of it can be purely rational, bud. So like we know these truths, we try to like work from them. This is why we can say, oh, life is like this, the world's like this. And you have like Thomas Aquinas using philosophy to say this is why there must be a God, for instance, and we can make an argument about it. But we can also behold faiths revealed to us, truths of the faith revealed to us, which still is at an intellectual level on one hand. We go, oh, this is the faith revealed by the church. So does it work out, so to speak, intellectually or not? But to your point, even when you know both, if you beheld both rational and revealed truths, the question is, what are you going to do about it? And this is where the will comes in. I think oftentimes when we talk about what do you want to do, we have a sort of flattening where desire and will are sort of one thing. Mm. So when you go like, oh, I shouldn't eat that cake, but I really want to. Like, let's take that phrase. So obviously the intellectual part is I know I shouldn't eat the cake. I've had enough already. I am overweight. It's becoming confessional. I am diabetic. So that's the intellectual part. But then there's the whole I want to. I admit I want to eat it. And I think people just see it as a two-way battle, right? Like, well, there's what you want, but there's what you know you shouldn't do. But actually sitting between those things, because our desires are usually from our passions, right? Like we sort of interact with the world and, we're enticed to be angry or to want things or to flee from them, all these different ways. What the church says is you have the will. And the will should consider the intellect and make a decision that like is not irrational. But there's, of course, all sorts of things, Bud, where in this life, on one hand, our intellect will only know so much. And then two, there's things that are supra-rational, which means they're not irrational, but like you said, they can only be acted upon if we trust. And another very Newman, John Henry Newman making a big point about this in things like the Grammar of Assent. Those are the will. So you can be presented with things, and you can understand them as the best you can, and you can think about what you want, like desire, but what you're going to do, that's the will. And prayer is actually mostly about the will. And I think people don't get that, but I think mostly we think prayer is either this intellectual thinking about God, or we imagine it's like, oh, I really want this, and God is a cosmic Santa Claus, and I'm going to tell him what I want. But prayer is actually about the will. What do I compel myself towards? What desires do I say yes to, and which one is the most fundamental that I'm going to act upon? And that should be the desire for God's love.
Could I pose a question to you, and you can help me unthread this on the radio?
Sure. Let's see if we can get the bishop mad with us in live time.
No, I'm thinking about this because I don't want to present what we're saying about the will as anti-intellectual.
Oh, no, not at all.
Not at all. Yeah. But there is this interesting point. So one of the most popular titles for Our Lady among the church fathers, like the early Christian writers, is that she's the new Eve. And you can see all these parallels where, she's the mother of all Christians, of all the baptized.
One of the most important titles that I learned to start wanting to come into the Catholic Church. So yes.
So let me ask you about this. In Genesis, so if you put up Mary's experience in her fiat and you kind of contrast it with Adam and Eve's lapse or their fall, so when God places our first parents in the garden and they have all that they need for their sustenance, the one fruit they're not supposed to eat is the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So like it's fascinating to me that sort of like boundary marker has to do with knowledge. There's kind of a knowledge that they'll gain that they don't presently have, whereas they're asked to just trust themselves to God's word. So I mean, their sin in that instance is an act of the will, like they desire something that's contrary to God's word. But how do you understand, like, the knowledge piece there?
Well, this would be interesting, and this is something where if we were more prepared...
Let's call Matthew Umbarger.
That's right.
Let's just, out of the blue.
So this is interesting, right? That's what I was going to say. On one hand, what the Hebrew says and how it ends up being knowledge would be very interesting. What I'm wondering, though, if you go to someone like the medieval scholastics like Thomas, of course, there's two ways in which we can mean knowledge. So let's say on one hand, it's like... Is this a tree about the propositional knowledge of good and evil? Or is it like, I'll be honest, like knowing in the biblical sense, which is usually a euphemism literally used in the Bible that talks about we'll be honest, intercourse or like closeness, right, with actual two human beings. And I think this comes from, right, that knowledge of good and evil, meaning connatural knowledge. So like the dorky philosophical term, meaning something you can only know through experience.
Yeah.
And so... my take immediately, that I would love to be corrected if people hear it, is I think the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is to say God goes, to know it that way is to experience it, and then, of course, you only know it through committing an evil, which is to abrogate a law that I gave for your sake. So it's not that and I think that Satan is, because Satan's whole temptation, man, is just about only saying half-truths. That's one of the hard things you have to think about with the devil. When he goes like, surely you won't die, he's not completely wrong. You can imagine Adam and Eve go back and be like, hey, man, you said we were going to die. And he's like, why didn't I just meant like tomorrow, not eventually. Or if he goes like, you'll be like gods. They're like, hey, snake dude, you said we're going to be like God. And he's like, you kind of are.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, that's not what we meant, right? So Satan loves half-truths. And so I think he's pulling one of these numbers is you got to get this sense, or at least this is how some people have taken it poetically, that Satan's like, guys, there's this great knowledge about good and evil, and God's not even going to let you have it. But actually what I think that he means is there is connatural knowledge that you can only have through experience, and the only way to experience that is to be evil. I know that I'm getting into a whole can of worms about how like evil is a
privation
of the good, and there's a way that like God, of course, knows evil without. But God, this is the weird thing about, of course, God doesn't know anything connaturally, which people like might freak people out. You're like, oh, so that means humans can do something God can't? And you're like, yeah, but it's because of a deprivation.
Yeah.
God knows all things from the fact that none of it would exist except that he's made or allowed it to exist. So that's not quite the claim it sounds like it is. But that's what I think is going on, and that's why you're right. The will part is important, because in faith, there's going to be all sorts of times where, I think about this with raising kids. You got to trust me, little guy. You're not ready to understand, and even if I could tell you the truth, it would only scar or scare you or confuse you. And so that's an act of will to go, I'm going to trust mom and dad that they're lifting a burden that's too heavy for me currently. And I think that's all God was saying is like, if you break this law, you'll get that knowledge, but it will be the worst way possible to get knowledge of good and evil.
That's a really fascinating, I'm kind of jumping all over the place here, but a fascinating thing about Satan. And, I feel like it'd be easier for us if Satan was just like terrible in the sense of just like this direct frontal attack against us. But with both the temptation in the Garden of Eden, and then later, like a couple weeks ago on the show, we talked about the temptation of our Lord in the wilderness. You're right. Like Satan harnesses the word of God. Like, I think the Old Testament one time refers to him as an angel of light. And that's a really important thing for us to reflect upon. Satan's not often like, hey man, like, just drink that poison. It's actually taking a promise that God's given and sort of like twisting it or warping it. And that's, like you mentioned that Mary as the new Eve, that was sort of an idea that helped like draw you into the Catholic Church. You know, I think to dork out a little bit, we've mentioned before on the show, J.R. Tolkien, the great author and writer, composed the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Like, he portrays March 25th as the day on which the world was created. And with Mary's fiat, with her annunciation or acceptance of the will of God, there is a new creation. Behold, all things are new. And so even though in the grand scheme of history, we're still moving towards the new heaven and the new earth, the Jerusalem that comes down from heaven, like at that moment, there was like all things were made new. Once Mary, like in God's great design, like once she gave her fiat, in a sense, like Satan's days were numbered, you know, like the conclude, like we are moving to the telos of human history.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think the earliest Christians, not all of them maybe, but many of them argued that March 25th was the first Easter. And I mean, part of this is it's a convention of ancients that like, oh, really important people are either conceived or born on the same day they'll die. So, you know, you got the Annunciation, of course, and then, you know, his death. But I think Tolkien, along with other people who are attuned to this, make this great point, right, about that creation and recreation and recapitulation all sort of flow into each other. But this gets down to the will. Mary, and I mean, Satan is all about the will too, because Satan, of course, doesn't have our problem, which is lack of information. Yeah. This is one thing where I go, there has to be a way in which you can just have a malformed will. And we have 5 minutes left in this segment, so we can't get into the whole, like, are all men saved thing too much. But one of the things you would have to wrestle with is a lot of times people go like, hey, man, how could God punish people to go to hell? It's just a lack of information. If they knew everything, they wouldn't choose it. And you go, well, you have this real problem with the angels. So you either have to like throw out all of Christian angelology or radically transform what's being said, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. But the devil didn't have like, oh, I wonder what will happen if we all try to rebel against God. He refused to serve. Yeah. And I mean, I have to admit, the more I go through life, idealistic Bo, who loves Socrates and Plato, was like, man, if you just inform people, they'll come around. Mm. But Bud, I've not lived like a long life, but I've lived enough to go, man, I think there's some people that you could tell them the truth about all sorts of things and they would still obstinately choose against it. Such is the power of the will and its importance, which is not anti-intellectual, but it certainly is a power alongside the intellect and our capacity, our appetitive capacity to have appetites and desires.
Well, this is kind of reassuring to me, but also something important to keep in mind. I love this little foray into like spiritual warfare that we're getting into, but doesn't St. Thomas say, so like, I know there's rare cases of possession where a demon actually sort of like gains control in some sense of someone's body or is like influencing the activities of their body. But for the most part, when you think about, especially as we go through life, like if we're baptized or after receiving absolution and confession, like Satan can't like move our arm, right? So the only way that Satan can defeat us or trip us up is by the power of suggestion. And this gets back to the will. It's not like he can overwhelm necessarily our intellectual faculties, or like I said, possession is very rare. But Satan can only move us through these half-truths, through these temptations, and that kind of reminds us of the sort of battle that we're facing.
Yeah, I actually think in that regard, I didn't expect the exorcism part at the end here, but I do think it's the case that it's much more helpful to think of whatever possession ends up being akin to addiction. And so this is where people go like, oh, there aren't demons, there's addiction. I'm like, no, there's distinct, but like it is, the reason it's similar is because the will has to be the same way. We all know people, well, maybe we don't, maybe you're lucky. I know people, I think many people know people that at the start of an addictive behavior or pattern of behavior, you're like, that person chose to keep down that road. And they had clear, now it was very tempting that you go, they had control of their will and they kept choosing. At some point down the ladder of addiction, you can say something like, they're not even choosing anymore.
Yeah.
And they probably don't even want to do what they're doing, but so addled chemically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and physically, they can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Well, demon possession has to work similarly. You're right. You don't have to walk through life being like, there I was being a great Christian, and then boom, the devil like got in control of
the joystick,
the joystick in my soul. Yeah. Now, I do think though that like what the corollary that might freak people out is like I think sometimes we acquiesce far more to temptation than we want to realize, and so that's not to be. But like the scary monster, like the devil just overrides your brain pattern. That's not the case. And but we go back and return to this sort of landing this ship in the last minute. Yeah. What we go back to is Joseph and Mary. If we don't have that silence in our prayer life where we let God speak through the silence of our will that allows his desires to speak through us, if we have that, we don't have to worry about the demons. In the same way, if we imitate Our Lady and we say, behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it done to me according to thy word. We behold the truth of the faith, and then we acquiesce, we surrender our will to those truths. I mean, that's in the most basic way. Everything from the church that asks of Christians builds from those two things. God speaking in the silence of our hearts, us beholding the truths of the faith, and then willing to do what God wills in and through us.
Well, it could be a whole nother episode, Bo, but like Mary, by actually serving God and submitting her will in this way, she possessed a greater level of freedom than we ever have by choosing our own path. But I know we're up against break.
Absolutely. So Joseph and Mary, pray for us. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, what can I say? Sometimes the Spirit just moves us. That was a fantastic episode. I sometimes feel like we've talked about some of these things before. Obviously, we've talked about St. Joseph. I know we've talked about the Annunciation, but I really think, I don't know, that kind of helped me clarify some of the stuff that we've been talking about, like we said, with the good people at the Catechetical Institute here in Des Moines about prayer.
No, it's great. You know, I've said this before on the show, but like I actually, I feel blessed to be a part of it and really appreciate the conversations that we have. Always interested to see where they're going to head. We started the show with baseball. If you want to round the bases and make it to home plate this Lent, we encourage you to join us in the prayer life of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Speaking of prayer.
So Iowa Catholic Radio, we broadcast the Rosary at 6 in the morning, also at 10 a.m., the Divine Mercy Chaplet at 2:55 in the afternoon, but you can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to donate. They have a donate button there, iowacatholicradio.com. You can call 515-223-1150 and call and text in order to donate to Iowa Catholic Radio, because even if you're listening on podcast or hearing this at some other way, we are produced. We are launched from Iowa Catholic Radio. We are very blessed to be a part of this. And I want to say this ministry, of course, it's not just the Catholic Radio is the people that you hear on the air. It's not the good people behind the boards or only the good people behind the desks. It is very much your ministry as well. It wouldn't exist without you. So speaking of prayers, we covet your prayers because your prayers help us stay on air, reach out to people. The electric media of radio, one of its greatest things is it's sort of ubiquitous. It's always on. It just takes someone tuning it in, and you never know when people might tune in to hear the good word preached, spoken of, prayed, etc., etc. We also thank all of our volunteers who make this possible. We couldn't do it without you. But again, we very much thank those who donate. Donations make this happen. You're not going to believe this, Bud, but a Catholic radio station is not just rolling in dough, but it exists because of the goodwill. We were talking about that, the goodwill of people who take their well-earned money and allow this apostolate to occur. So thank you very much. If you want to donate one more time, 515-223-1150, text or call, iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app. Was that a walk-off home run?
Amazing. I do call to mind this time of year that we're getting closer to Easter. It's funny how Lent works, because when you start Lent, it feels like it's going to be this long, impossible journey. And then once you start to approach the end of Lent, it feels like Easter has arrived so quickly. But I do like to remind our listeners, Bo, as well, like when we ask for their generosity, we ask for their prayers. I know that you and I both dedicate time in our weekly lives to pray for our listeners as well. So as we approach Easter this time of year, I want to say thank you to you all for helping to make this possible. We're so appreciative of all of your support, and please know that I wish you a very fruitful end to your Lenten journey and offer up my prayers on your behalf.
Absolutely. And like we said at the top of the show, one way that you can do that to celebrate, it'll be Easter season. It will be in full swing. Iowa Catholic Radio has always been so good to us here. Mercy College of Health Sciences underwrites our show, and we will be inaugurating our president. So that is April 14th, which is a Friday in Easter week, which means you can eat all the meat you would like, all of the sweets, all of it. But if you go to mchs.edu and look for the inauguration, we would love to have you at the inauguration mass at the very least 9 a.m. on April 14th. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.